During World War II, some survival tricks never reached the history books. They weren't in manuals, they weren't in training, because the men who used them kept them hidden, not from the enemy, but from their own armies. These tricks were brutal, desperate, and sometimes unthinkable, yet they worked. Whispers in the trenches. Secrets buried in ruined cities. Methods so effective they vanished for decades. Soldiers risked punishment, even death, rather than reveal them. Today, we uncover 7 of the most shocking World War II tricks soldiers refuse to share. And number 7 might be the most brutal survival lesson you've ever heard. Number 1, scent masking with river mud. When dogs, scouts, and enemy patrols were hunting for a single human scent, soldiers learned to make themselves vanish not by running, but by becoming part of the earth. In some occupied zones, the difference between capture and escape came down to a dirty handful of river mud. It started simple. Men stripped down in shallow water and rubbed a special blend of river silt, crushed leaves, and algae into every exposed crease: hands, neck, behind the ears, and inside collars. Not just any dirt would do. They learned to pick the cool, fine silt from slow bends in rivers where organic matter masked the human smell. The mud clogged pores and held the natural smells of riverbanks, fish, reed, rot, over the soldier's own scent. Patrol dogs would pick up a trail and find only the river's odor in their noses, and often confused, they lost interest. But the trick was more than mud on skin. Experienced men would smear the same mixture on their clothing, boots, and gear. They'd dab it on rations bags and even on discarded footprints to overwrite their trail. In one whispered account from partisan fighters, a scouting party slipped through a checkpoint by crawling in the reeds, leaving a trail saturated with river silt while their boots followed the old path. Soldiers who tried to brag about it were told to keep quiet. Commanders feared what would happen if every unit began using the same method and predictable hideouts were revealed. It wasn't perfect. Mud could dry, crack, and smell different in winter. It could irritate skin. And if you chose the wrong bank, the opposite effect could happen. You'd stand out. But when chosen carefully in the right place, this low-tech camouflage worked with terrifying simplicity. A man folded into the smell of the river, effectively invisible to the nose. Today, the lesson is a reminder. Survival often depends on blending, not fighting. In modern wilderness escapes or search and rescue scenarios, scent masking is a last-ditch technique, one that carries risks and legal, ethical implications. Never attempt it where it endangers wildlife, damages sensitive habitats, or breaks local laws. But if you find yourself down and desperate, recall that sometimes nature itself can hide you. Up next, a different kind of silence. The ration bag smoke screens that let whole squads disappear under a wall of smoke. Number 2, civilian swap kits. In the chaos of World War II, survival sometimes meant becoming someone else. Soldiers and operatives carried compact civilian swap kits, tiny bundles hidden beneath uniforms or stitched into linings, meant to let a man vanish, pass a checkpoint, or melt into town crowds. These were not full wardrobes. They were precise. A folded shirt, a plain cap, forged papers, a bar of soap, and a few essential props that could rewrite a soldier's identity in moments. The genius was concealment. A false bottom belt pouch, a stitched tunnel in a coat hem, or removable boot soles kept the kit invisible during casual searches. Men who knew the trick could peel back a lining, change into neutral clothes, darken or lighten faces with soot or powder, and walk away as someone else. Resistance fighters used them to move through hostile streets. Escapees crossed lines with nothing more than a swapped shirt and a confident step. Spies melted into crowds after gathering intelligence. One partisan recalled slipping through a German checkpoint by trading into a baker's shirt and carrying a fresh loaf, so ordinary it avoided notice. Others hid papers inside hollowed buttons or stitched tiny capsules into sheepskin linings. The kits were improvisation turned into a craft. How to fold documents without creasing stamps, which collar styles matched which towns, and how to remove army insignia without tearing fabric. But these kits carried weight beyond fabric and paper. They drew a moral line soldiers often crossed when orders and survival collided. Commanders feared their spread. If every unit disguised itself, discipline could fracture and chaos would grow. So many kits were kept secret even from fellow soldiers. Those who boasted risked punishment, suspicion, or worse. Tips were traded in whispers: where to find civilian collars, which towns accepted papers, and which accents could be mimicked. The method wasn't foolproof. Forged documents were checked, accents betrayed, and a single careless move could undo months of planning. Yet in countless small stories, a swap kit bought time. Time allowed escape, regrouping, or simply a chance at another sunrise. The raw currency of survival. Today, the idea survives in different form. Emergency go bags and identity precautions used by journalists and aid workers in hostile zones. The lesson remains: contingency and concealment can save lives. But there is a line. Using disguise to harm civilians or commit crimes crosses an ethical boundary. These kits were tools of escape, not tools of harm. Number 3, gas mask, bladder, water pouch. In the cold, chaotic months of World War II, when supply lines snapped and canteens went dry, some soldiers turned to one of the war's most overlooked objects: the rubber bladder from a gas mask. It sounds crude, and it was, but hidden inside those masks was a flexible lining that could be cleaned, repaired, and repurposed into a nearly invisible water pouch. For men trapped behind enemy lines or moving through hostile countryside, a single concealed pouch of water could mean the difference between life and death, stumbling on for another day and not moving at all. The trick began with a simple idea: reclaim what was already on a man's person. When gas mask bladders were damaged or replaced, resourceful soldiers kept the old linings. With basic needlework, a stitch here, a folded seam there, the bladder became a small pouch with a narrow neck that could be tied off or sealed with wax. The real craft was concealment. Pouches were flattened, rolled, and slipped into coat seams, sewn into hat bands, or tucked behind removable boot insoles. Patrols looked for rifles and knives, not a soft rubber sleeve hidden in a boot, and that made all the difference. Those who used the method developed quiet routines. They rinsed bladders with boiled water when possible or wiped them with alcohol to cut odor. Openings were padded with wax or cloth to stop leaks. The whole pouch was wrapped in fabric to prevent noise and scent. During long marches, men sometimes pooled their bladders, passing a single precious supply between pairs of lips so the weakest could drink. In several partisan accounts from occupied regions, fighters traded cigarettes or small foods for a sealed bladder from a sympathetic civilian, an exchange that bought hours, sometimes days. Commanders rarely endorsed such improvisation. Hidden supplies could be mistaken for hoarding or insubordination. If discovered, the owner risked punishment. So the technique spread in whispers, shown by hand in dugouts and taught in the dark, and was seldom written or reported. That secrecy is why many of these small survival practices vanished from official records. Today, we learn from them as historical lessons rather than how-to guides. Modern adventurers use certified hydration systems designed for safety and hygiene. Improvised rubber pouches carry real risks: contamination, leaks, and infection. Still, the wartime lesson remains. Survival often comes from making and hiding small advantages. They bought time, and sometimes they bought life. Number 4, underground air pipes. In the shattered landscapes of World War II, survival often meant disappearing completely, not for minutes, but for days. Soldiers, resistance fighters, and desperate families dug into the ground, hiding in cellars, tunnels, and makeshift burrows to avoid patrols that swept through ruins and forests. But there was one brutal truth. Without air, a hideout became a coffin. That is where one of the war's most ingenious and quietly terrifying tricks emerged: underground air pipes. At first glance, it was nothing more than a reed, a hollow stick, or a salvaged scrap of pipe. Yet when placed carefully, it allowed entire groups to breathe beneath rubble, fields, or forest floors without being seen. A thin pipe disguised under leaves, broken bricks, or even dung became a silent lifeline. From above, an enemy might walk directly over the hiding place. Hearing nothing, seeing nothing while below, hearts pounded in silence, stealing one more breath of air. The brilliance was in the deception. Fighters learned to angle pipes through roots or cracks so smoke, condensation, or breath wouldn't betray them. Some smeared the ends with mud, moss, or dung so dogs would sniff nothing unusual. Others split one pipe into several outlets so the air thinned into the wind, impossible to trace. In Polish resistance stories, families hid children under barn floors, with nothing but a hollowed reed poking up through hay. German patrols stopped and searched, but the sound of footsteps above became proof that the trick was working. It was not without terror. The longer you stayed underground, the hotter, darker, and more suffocating it became. One cough, one misplaced stone, or one careless shift of soil could expose everyone. Those who survived never forgot the taste of stale air drawn through a muddy tube, the fear of footsteps so close that even breathing felt like betrayal. Commanders rarely encouraged such methods. Official shelters were one thing, improvised holes in the earth were another. Yet when options ran out, these hidden pipes became lifelines, whispered from one survivor to another. They weren't just tricks, they were tests of endurance demanding patience, silence, and iron nerves. Today, we look back not to copy them, but to understand the brutal will that created them. Modern shelters use engineered ventilation, safe materials, and tested systems. But the lesson of the underground pipe endures. When the world above becomes hostile, survival may come down to the breath you manage to take unseen. Number 5, bread loaf safe houses. In World War II, survival often hid in plain sight. Patrols searched every pocket, every bag, every sleeve, but rarely the most ordinary thing on a table: a loaf of bread. That is where one of the war's strangest, most ingenious tricks was born. Resistance fighters and desperate civilians turned loaves into safe houses, not for people, but for secrets. Weapons, papers, even medicine vanished inside crusts that no soldier thought to slice. It was camouflage you could eat, and it saved lives. The method was as brutal as it was brilliant. Bakers, mothers, even starving families took knives and scooped out the soft heart of a loaf. The hollow was dried slightly, then filled with what mattered most: a folded map, forged identity papers, a vial of morphine, or a razor blade. Sometimes it was a capsule of poison meant for desperate last resort. The whole was stuffed with crumbs, sealed with a crust, brushed with water or oil, and baked for just long enough to look untouched. To a hungry soldier, it was bread. To the one carrying it, it was survival hidden beneath a golden crust. Stories from occupied cities tell of couriers walking calmly past checkpoints with loaves tucked under arms. German officers glanced at them and saw only food, not escape routes. In rural France, one family smuggled radio parts piece by piece inside loaves, assembling the full set weeks later. In Poland, loaves carried rolled-up banknotes to pay for bribes. In Italy, one loaf carried penicillin that saved 3 wounded partisans hiding in a barn. A soldier might seize the bread and eat half of it without ever knowing he'd just swallowed the evidence. But this trick carried fear with every step. Bread was scarce, and carrying more than your ration drew suspicion. If a loaf looked too heavy or felt uneven, it could be torn open on the spot, and discovery meant prison, or worse. That is why many who used the trick never spoke of it again. It was too dangerous, too desperate, and too tied to betrayal. Yet the lesson lingers. Today, the idea of hiding valuables inside everyday objects is common in espionage and survival design. Hollow books, disguised containers, false bottom packages all owe something to the war's bread loaves. They remind us that survival isn't always about weapons or strength. Sometimes, it's about turning the most ordinary thing into a fortress. And in those dark years, nothing was more ordinary or more underestimated than bread. Number 6, chewed paper filters. In World War II, survival sometimes meant inventing protection out of nothing. Gas attacks, smoke from burning cities, and dust from collapsing buildings made every breath dangerous. Official gas masks were scarce, often broken, and rarely enough for everyone. So men and women turned to something that seemed like useless scraps of paper. With nothing more than spit and desperation, they chewed those scraps into crude filters that kept them breathing when the air itself turned hostile. The method was shockingly simple, but it carried brutal stakes. Soldiers would tear thin paper newspapers, ration slips, even old letters, and chew it until it became a thick, soggy pulp. This pulp, stuffed into cloth or pressed between rags, turned into an improvised filter. Moist fibers trapped dust, slowed smoke, and gave the lungs a fighting chance. In basements under bombardment, civilians pressed wet paper into jars and breathed through holes in the lids. In trenches, soldiers chewed until their mouths bled, spitting pulp into socks to breathe through the damp fabric. It wasn't clean, it wasn't safe, but it worked long enough to stay alive. Eyewitness accounts describe families in ruined cities passing chewed wads between them, reshaping filters as smoke poured through cracks. Partisan fighters who lacked proper gear stuffed wet pulp into wooden tubes, making crude mask canisters. Some used vinegar or urine to dampen the paper, believing it neutralized poison gases. Whether that science held or not, the act of doing something, anything, gave them a chance where none should have existed. But the trick was never perfect. The pulp clogged quickly. It reeked of spit, ash, and fear. Breathing through it felt like drowning on land. Those who survived swore they would never forget the taste. Commanders discouraged the practice, fearing infection. But when the air choked and lungs burned, no order mattered. People chewed, stuffed, and prayed. Today, we see modern masks engineered with filters that save lives in fires, factories, and disaster zones. But the lesson of the chewed paper filter remains. Survival isn't always clean, or safe, or certain. Sometimes it is raw, desperate, and ugly. And, in those moments, even a scrap of paper and a mouthful of spit could mean the difference between another breath or none at all. Number 7, silent foot wraps. In the silent hours of World War II, when patrols stalked ruined streets and forests echoed with gunfire, survival often depended not on weapons but on footsteps. The crunch of gravel, the snap of a twig, even the soft squeak of a boot could give everything away. That is why some soldiers and partisans turned to a brutal, improvised trick, the silent foot wrap. A strip of cloth wrapped tight around boots or bare feet turned noisy steps into whispers, allowing men to move where silence meant life. The trick was deceptively simple. Soldiers tore rags from ruined uniforms, sheets, or even burial shrouds, soaking them in water or pressing them into mud before binding them around soles. Wet cloth deadened sound, softened edges, and gripped the ground in ways leather boots could not. On rubble, the wraps muted crunching stone. In forests, they blended footsteps with the muffled hush of leaves. Fighters who mastered the method could pass within meters of patrols, leaving enemies staring into darkness, hearing nothing. Some partisans crafted wraps with layers, outer strips of cloth, inner padding of moss, straw, or even torn paper. The layering absorbed shock and spread weight, so steps landed soft as animal paws. In Eastern Europe, resistance groups were known to coat wraps with ash or soot, creating both silence and camouflage, leaving tracks that looked like nothing human. For couriers, scouts, and saboteurs, foot wraps were not just convenience, they were survival kits tied to their feet. But this trick carried its own punishment. Cloth wore thin fast. Sharp rubble tore wraps open. Winter froze them stiff. Mud rotted them in hours. Feet blistered, bled, and sometimes froze inside sodden bindings. Yet soldiers accepted the pain, because silence bought them time. In diaries and whispered recollections, men admitted that they feared their own boots more than enemy guns. A careless step could end not only a mission, but an entire unit. Commanders rarely recorded the practice. Officially, armies had boots, not rags. Yet the reality of war forced men to improvise, to do whatever it took to stay unseen and unheard. These wraps remained the hidden knowledge of fighters who crawled, crept, and vanished into night. Today, high-tech forces use padded soles, noise-canceling gear, and engineered materials to achieve the same end. But the lesson of the silent foot wrap endures. Survival sometimes rests not in strength or speed, but in absolute quiet. In a world where one sound could mean discovery, a ragged strip of cloth turned men into shadows. The forgotten tricks of World War II remind us of something we often overlook. Survival has never been about technology alone. It was built on improvisation, resourcefulness, and the raw will to endure when nothing else remained. Soldiers and civilians weren't equipped with endless supplies, high-tech weapons, or guaranteed rescue. They relied on scraps, discarded objects, and instincts sharpened by desperation. From bread loaves turned into hiding places, to chewed paper that became makeshift filters, to silent foot wraps that erased sound itself, every method reveals the same truth. Survival is about adaptation. Each story holds a lesson for us today. Modern life feels secure, shelves stocked, taps flowing, electricity constant. But history teaches that stability can vanish without warning. A blackout, a shortage, a crisis, and suddenly, knowing how to think creatively with what you already have can mean everything. These wartime tricks are not just curiosities, they are blueprints for resilience. They show us how to remain calm under pressure, how to innovate with almost nothing, and how to see opportunity hidden inside ordinary things. If you've stayed with me until now, you already know these lessons shouldn't be buried in archives. They deserve to be remembered, shared, and practiced because tomorrow is uncertain. By subscribing, you don't just follow another channel, you join a community determined to preserve knowledge that once kept people alive against impossible odds. Don't leave history's wisdom behind. Carry it forward. Hit subscribe now and be ready for what the world refuses to prepare you for.